Welcome to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host, and we're going to be looking at a very pretty melody today that is by an artist that has been introduced to me just recently, and I am a little bit fascinated with the breadth of music that is in an area that I have not been following a lot recently, which is game music. And this melody is brought to us today by an artist named Troisnyx. She is a proverbial wearer of several hats: a composer, arranger, lyricist, drummer, video game scorer, and general multi instrumentalist based in Lancashire, England. In her every musical endeavor, there is a palpable passion and an undercurrent of warmth and light, and I will agree with that. She is known for emotional honesty in her music. She also produces some visual content for the music she releases, though not nearly as frequently as she makes music. Welcome to the Melodology Podcast, Troisnyx.
Thank you for having me. Apologies for the throat.
That's all right. This is the first time we're talking about a melody that's going to be from gaming music. I have a lot of connections through the Twitterverse and the new music Twitter community with composers of game music. The last episode we had Tony Manfredonia, and we had a piece of his from Call of Saragnar that we listened to at the end of the podcast, and that was a lot of fun. And I have always loved game music, back all the way to being obsessed with Mario and the music back in the 1990s, sitting in front of a console and just playing game after game after game, and the Atari music and things like that. So game music has come a long, long way, including some games that have full orchestral music, some games that are fully orchestral but arranged and recorded on computer, and some that, again, the games go back and they make the 8-bit sound, the very distinct sound from when the games had very little sound depth available to them.
Mm.
So, Troisnyx, tell me about your background with game music and what brought you into game music.
The first exposure at all that I had to any form of game music, in fact, was for my first game, Prince of Persia for Amstrad. And it was one of the few instances of the old computers ever actually venturing out of the UK, because I didn't grow up in the UK. Um, and I had no sound blaster, so I couldn't actually hear the full depth of the song. So it was just the single melody line. And, the single melody line was effective enough. You still remember it like years and years and years after you first encountered it. I was 3 when I first encountered that game. Um, so the fact that I still remember it is testament to that. Then, well, where I grew up was basically a hotspot for software piracy. So very many
Mm.
of us had bootleg Nintendo Entertainment Systems and other such software, and I had loads of games that ran on the bootleg theirs, and some of them were Famicom games as well. So I grew up with the old Mario themes. My favorites for the NES were the soundtrack of Kirby's Adventure and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. Those were a few of the games that made full use of the NES sound chip, if you would. It sounded like something you would hear in a live venue, just bit crushed and done with a small chip, which I felt was really impressive. Um, then my first exposure to music that sounded like it was orchestral in any way, shape, or form was with the PlayStation 2. I got introduced to the Kingdom Hearts series and Final Fantasy X, and I played the heck out of those games um, a lot. And it kept going from there. But my first foray into writing game music was through Newgrounds. I joined that site in 2011. It's still going strong. I mean, it started in 95. It's still going strong. And last decade, there were game jams that were hosted on the regular by Newgrounds staff. And I took part in one of them, and that was actually around this time 10 years ago. And I happen to be fortunate enough to be put together with a team, an artist, a programmer, a a writer, a sound designer, and myself. And I had no MIDI keyboard. I just mouse clicked every note. And we had a few days. We had 3 days to make a fully functional game based on a prompt that was given to us. That's the basis of game jams everywhere. And when it was done, we had a playable game. And then my first thought was, I scored a game. Well,
Of course you did.
so I was riding on that high, and at that point, it was no longer a theory in my head that yeah I could do it too. It was a reality that yeah I'm doing this now. Um, I'd long wanted to score video game music, and when I was finally able to in December of last year, I just fully embraced it. As soon as I was able to get employment, I was out the door with an opportunity that was presented to me to do session work and voice acting for Ravita, which is a roguelite for Switch and Steam. And I've also since scored, well, half scored, because I worked together with Maro. I've since half scored a visual novel that seems to have gotten quite a bit of popularity to it now called Mythic Meetup. I wasn't expecting it to blow up the way it did. Um, and I'm just going with the flow on this one, seeing who would have me for the next project. I guess that's every video game composer's thoughts right there, to be honest.
Tell us a little bit more about Newgrounds because I hadn't heard of it before you mentioned it, and it's a really fascinating resource.
So, Tom Fulp is the founder of Newgrounds. He still runs it, along with a small team of staff, and he came up with it b to host indie games and some of his own creations because he was fascinated with a console called the Neo Geo. He was fascinated with the games that were on it. Newgrounds is a sort of paraphrase of the name Neo Geo, as you can imagine. In fact, there were 2 sites. I think I don't remember what the first one was called. It was something to do with the borrowing of the name Neo Geo, and then there was another one called Newground Remix. The 2 of them were amalgamated at some point, and they became Newgrounds, and initially it started as a place for people to post Flash animations and games. In 2003, the audio portal was opened up on Newgrounds, meaning that people could submit their tracks on there, most often for use in these games or these animations. And it's since taken its own turn where people can basically post anything, including live sets, podcasts, voice acting reels. And then the art portal where people could submit concept art or just GIF animations, that came a few years later. Um, and it's got quite a culture of its own where it's got like sort of holidays of its own based on previous IPs that it's created. Like Super Meat Boy was created by users on Newgrounds. Uh Friday Night Funkin's another popular game that was created by new users on Newgrounds. The same with Among Us. But there have been other such characters and games that have defined Newgrounds culture over the years. And um it, it's basically a creative site for indies, uh, well, and even triple A's who still decide to use the site. Uh, but yeah, it's a creative site with a rabbit hole of culture all on its own. And its tagline is everything by everyone.
Wow. That's definitely all encompassing there. Now, game music is interesting. There's so many different kinds of games. And like with film scores, you kind of have to have music that can fit any situation
Mm,
because you can have any scene in a game and you can have any environment in a game
mm,
and you can have any time period in a
of
game.
course.
And then you can have you have moments where something's happening, and you're not involved in it and you're just watching, and there can be actually a fully scored scene
Mm,
in the middle of a game.
mhm.
I also remember one of my favorite, with kind of music, but very much ambient sound, were the Myst games,
Mm,
where you've just got this kind of beautiful, environmental, atmospheric. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's the sound of the environment that you're in.
yes.
Uh, what's your favorite kind of music to write, or do you have a favorite kind of music to write when you're dealing with game music?
Um, Admittedly, and this is a legit musical aspiration of mine, um, my favorite soundtrack of all time comes from the Arthur trilogy of games. Uh, there are a series of JRPGs, very little known JRPGs, that were released between 2006 and 2009 for the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. Uh, there was some suggestive themes, some of them going very suggestive, but very many of them dealt with mental health, especially the mental
Hmm.
health of a group of singing bards in this universe called Raver Tales. And the music is heavily vocally layered, um, draws influence from lots of nasal chants, especially the Eastern European nasal chants, Bulgarian choirs, a lot of influence from Japanese traditional music. There's so much that goes into it. It sounds like an entire choir is singing it all at once. In universe, these Raver Tales can basically sing several parts all at once. And the reason why I like this is not just for the emotional literacy. They made an entire workable constructed language. It's workable. There is a syntax
Hmm.
to it. And the best part of this, which I've not seen replicated anywhere else, is that they had several dedicated teams over at, I'm presuming Gust did this, or maybe Namco Bandai with the release of Artanelico 3. But there were several teams of dedicated musicians that came up with several of these vocal themes for the course of the game. And you would have
Hmm.
easily 10, 20 of these. And these were full songs. These are like things you'd hear in an Enya record. Or maybe
Oh.
maybe more passionate in some cases. But that's the kind of level of dedication. The entire game was written with music in mind. Music drove the plot, the language, the constructed language, hymnos drove the plot. It drove a lot of the character interactions because it starts with three emotion sounds at every sentence. So there's
Hmm.
just, it's a way of world building that is so rarely done, I find. And the sounds themselves need not necessarily be adaptive to how much activity is going on screen. What matters is the music that's playing, the emotions that are being conveyed. And these people did a good job of doing exactly that.
I will put links to the music that we're talking about and the different games and so forth that we're talking about in the program notes for the
Mm.
podcast. And of course, are you a fan of film scores?
To some extent, yes. I like the John Williams stuff. I actually love the. I'm trying to remember who scored Star Trek 4, The Search for Spock.
Leonard Rosenman scored the fourth
Yeah,
Star Trek movie, and it was a big
I
departure.
remember it being especially breathtaking in the beginning. So that marked me. Um, Howard Shore stuff also sticks in my mind, I guess, because I certainly was a fan of the Lord of the Rings stuff.
Mhm.
So that's that. Um, I mean, I am going to like A.R. Rahman because one, he he's South Asian just like me. Two, he made Bollywood score just work in a way that most others didn't. And I don't know whether it's a question of people not getting the opportunity to do what he does. Maybe that's a factor. And I gotta acknowledge that. I also gotta acknowledge what he's done.
Do you have an earliest memory of a melody?
The Prince of Persia one certainly counts as one of them. Uh, Probably the only other one I can think of was a hymn that my mother used to sing to me, probably thinking that she didn't have long for that world. Uh, I wouldn't know the significance of it until she asked for that hymn to be played at her funeral. And she died when I was 17, and that particular melody got played. And it was Softly and Tenderly Jesus is Calling. And that I don't think I'm able to muster it, but that was the first, and that hit me the hardest.
Did she affect your musical background and life in different ways?
For better and for worse. I think for better in the sense that she was also a musician. She certainly had an idea beyond most what good music was. But again, this was in a society where emotional literacy and the talk of emotional literacy is repressed. So I think she was just like me in my early years, grasping at what makes music good without really being able to express it. And that was she wanted me to capture that. But at the same time, I don't know how to reconcile it with the fact that she and my dad wanted me to play the piano or some other, in inverted commas, girly instrument, and at a dilettantish level at that. I mean,
Mm,
it's a privilege to have been able to start young, to have been able to play, but it's not when you're getting abused for it. When I
mm,
showed more interest in wanting to take it further, wanting to actually go to higher education, or when I wanted to pick up another instrument that was not in their approved list, that's when they came down hard on me, and I
mm.
still bear the repercussions of it to this day. To this day, I still feel afraid of sharing my what I like to call my true song. I've only come very close with it, but not quite there. And I don't think it's a matter of skill. I do feel it's a matter of being safe to fully be able to express myself.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that and for being so open here in the podcast. Anything else you'd like to say before we take a break?
Mm, beep. No, seriously, I can't think of anything.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a break and then we will come back and we will talk about this episode's melody. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast. My name is Arthur Breur and I am here today with the artist named Troisnyx, who I have met through social media, through the Twitter New Music universe. And Troisnyx, you introduced me to an artist who I'd never heard of before named Phyrnna. Phyrnna has done a lot of the scores for the Epic Battle Fantasy series, except for one.
Yes.
Tell me about Phyrnna and your experience with Phyrnna's music.
Phyrnna, I'm not exactly sure when she started composing, but if my memory's correct, I believe I saw her earlier stuff on Newgrounds date back to 2009, 2010. So before she got the position to score for Epic Battle Fantasy 2, because originally Epic Battle Fantasy 1 did not have an original score of its own, it just borrowed music from other games. Back when rules were a lot laxer on this matter. Um Before that point, she frequently uploaded improvs on the piano. She was also a self-taught pianist. Certainly back in the day, she was feeling her way through the keys, and she certainly had an idea of good tonality. You could feel it in some people. They have a grasp of it, they could sense it. So then I came across Phyrnna stuff and the EBF series of games through EBF 3. Epic Battle Fantasy 3 was pretty popular around about the time that I joined Newgrounds, which was 2011. Well, I think it was released in 2010, but it was still popular by the time that I joined, so I decided to give it a play for myself. And I don't remember the title theme that was used there, but the first area theme in that entire game is Estavius, which is the song whose melody we are talking about today. And you're spending a lot of time in that particular hub area. That's where the shops are. That's where a lot of your side quests are. You are going to be doing a lot of back and forth between that hub world, so to speak. So Estavius, the melody of Estavius is firmly implanted in your mind, and that's how I received it. Really, future applications of that particular track, or as a title theme, or as a sort of navigation theme between the worlds, something like that, in future titles. Now, I came across Phyrnna herself. I sent her a message, a friendly message in 2012 on Newgrounds, because I was trying to make a circle of friends on a site that I barely even knew. And I thought maybe, just maybe, it might be a good idea to get in touch with her. I don't know. Can I? I'll try. And I I long figured that her melodies were the kind that were not only memorable, but they would work with several different forms of chord progressions underneath them.
Hmm.
And to demonstrate that, around about the time that I was preparing for my final exams in my Bachelor of Law, I decided to be an absolute mad lass and write a long orchestral medley of the tracks that she scored for Bullet Heaven, which was the first of the three bullet hell type games in existence. They're basically like really difficult shooters, really difficult vertical shooters. Um, and there were 6 tracks in total, and I remembered the melodies to all of them. So I decided to orchestrate it like it was some long credits theme, if you would. And I didn't know how to mix at all back then. The only thing I knew was the tonality, but that was enough. That she warmly received it, which I was pleased by. And then a year later, 2013, the audio portal on Newgrounds celebrated 10 years of its existence. There was a contest that was run on there that basically went along the lines of pick an artist you like on Newgrounds, do a remix or a cover of a track of theirs, and the winner is the one who's the most transformative and has knowledge of production, etc., etc. I had zero knowledge of production. I scored third place, which was pretty big deal in those days. And I mixed one of Phyrnna's. It was a lullaby that she wrote for a fan's son, called "Sleep Wrapped in Love." I decided to make it a vocal version instead. So after that point, we kept in touch on and off, and she continued to score the games, the Epic Battle Fantasy games. 4 came out, and then 5. Uh, 2018, she contacted me. Uh, Summer of 2018, actually, asked if I'd be willing to do a cover, an acoustic cover, so to speak, of one of the songs that she wrote for the game called "A Breeze from Home," and I I managed it. I was full of a cold, so I was kind of crooning rather than singing. And I was struggling to play guitar because, like, my knowledge of guitar really is open chords. So to do anything beyond that would basically make it very mistake ridden. And so I kind of tried to mask my mistake ridden playing with a MIDI guitar on top of it. And MIDI guitars have a reputation of not really sounding all that good. So, but I tried. Um, it seems to also have had quite a warm reception in the fan base.
Oh, nice.
So after that point, we've been in touch on and off. I've done the occasional cover of songs from the Epic Battle Fantasy series whenever the mood's taken me, and that's where I'm at today. I think she's on hiatus at the moment. Question mark. She has released one song. in the last few months or so, but I think she might still be in hiatus. I'm not sure.
Her Twitter still says she's on hiatus, and
Yeah, that's
other things
fair
say
enough.
that.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of music to dive through if you've never heard of Phyrnna before. So if you have not, and I will put again links in the show notes, absolutely listen to some of her music because it's everything you want in a in game music because it takes you on different emotional rides, adventure rides, happy rides, sad rides, all of those different voyages that you go on when you do gaming. A lot of times people just don't think about the music that's in the background, but you can listen to all of this music as tracks, and it to me it always takes me back into the game just the way watching listening to a movie score takes me back into the movie.
Mm.
Today's track that we're listening to, today's melody is Estavius, and it it's funny because when you mentioned the name to me, or I saw the name, I was like, "Oh, this is sounds interesting." And then when I listened to the melody, I was really surprised at how it's played more quickly, I think, in the actual track on the game.
Mm.
But there's also a piano version that Phyrnna released,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a beautiful, very lyrical melody,
Mm.
very much a song melody. So let's go ahead and take a look and a listen to Estavius from Epic Battle Fantasy 4. What is it that you see in the notes of the melody that Phyrnna is doing with the composition?
Mm. Mostly full steps up, down, the occasional interval leap. It's got that wistful, almost mournful quality of that you would expect in Irish folk music.
And I'm noticing there's this repeated kind of syncopated rhythm that she uses, and she uses it twice in the very first phrase.
Mm.
So, and that's a piece or that's an element that's used throughout the entire song, and it's a very much that da 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 da
Mm.
da pattern
Mhm.
is it's kind of its own little hook. It's it's a rhythm hook in this piece, and she does use it throughout, and she varies it a little bit throughout as well. I also notice we've got a nice just at the very beginning here. We've got a nice rising up of the
Mm.
melody. We've talked a number of times on the podcast how melodies often have an arc where they go up and they come back down.
Mm.
I always say melodies are stretchy because you start out in a certain spot, and if you get too far from that spot, your ear wants to bring you back to the area where you started or
Yes.
relatively close to the area where you started.
Mhm.
And that can be something that happens as well. In some cases, the farther you start away from the tonic, the home note, the
Mm.
more you're being pulled toward that home note as well. And we're starting down a sixth from the tonic in this, and I find it interesting that as we are moving in this melody, it's avoiding landing on the tonic. You hit the tonic on an offbeat in in that second measure,
Mm.
and then you end up on the tonic in the fourth measure. You end up on it, but you're in the minor
Chord.
six
Yeah, the
chord,
minor
the A,
sixth chord,
A
yeah.
minor here. So even though you're on the home note, you're not actually stably landing on the home note.
No.
You're in a place where it's not the tonal center of that moment.
Mm.
And then at the end of this phrase, you end up on the leading tone. You end up a half step down from the home note.
Mhm.
So it's a nice sort of traveling tune, a traveling melody where it's moving itself around without necessarily landing where it's going to land.
Mm. From what I've come to understand, certainly whenever anyone has remixed Estavius over the years, and when I've remixed it as well, slight deviations from the rhythm have certainly been permitted. Like, so long as it aids in the flow of the notes, so long as you still have that, you keep the notes, you still have that traveling feel. So, for instance, the lyrics that I went with when I revisited this on Phyrnna's request were Oh, never have I dreamed that I would journey far and wide. So there is some slight, um, but it still keeps the core of it. At the end of the day, I do feel it's less about the rhythm itself because you can still hover around it, and it's much more about the notes that make it up.
I've noticed it more when you were singing it that she's using a lot of just a three-step pattern. It starts out with a three-step pattern.
Mhm.
She has a downward three-step pattern in the third measure. Fourth measure has an upward three-step pattern. It's very much a vocal melody because it is mostly going stepwise, and then when it's doing leaps on the chord that it's on. But
Mm.
it's very much following good songwriting rules,
It is
good melody writing rules.
exceedingly cantabile. It is exceedingly cantabile.
And cantabile, for the folks on the podcast who don't know music lingo, means sung
Or singable.
in a singable way.
Mm.
All right, so let's go ahead and play the beginning again, and then we'll play the second phrase as well. So again, here we've got that repeated rhythmic pattern. We also have more repeats of that tool or that element that she's using of the three notes in a scale.
Mm.
And that's in every measure that's moving until we get to the last measure of that phrase.
Mhm.
So really, so far, pretty much every measure. I mean, if you consider the opening notes of the melody as part of the first measure, every measure has a three note stepwise
Yes.
motif in it.
Yes, it does.
It's almost part of the DNA of this melody. It seems like.
Mm. And the best part about this is I'm almost certain that this was completely subconscious. This was not a conscious decision as well. This feels like, I mean, certainly looking at phrase 1 and phrase 2 and knowing that the whole thing's been subconscious, to me, it seems as though it's drawn from like the entire DNA of whatever songs we may remember or may have somehow remembered and all jumbled up into our mind over the years. This is kind of like drawing from subconscious musical knowledge, and that's the beauty of it. I find.
Yeah, and looking at the two phrases we have here, the first phrase you have the introductory notes, but it really kind of goes from G up to D,
Mm.
and and the highest note in that part of it, it gets up to E, and so it's going up and arcing back down. The second phrase starts on A and goes up a fifth to E,
Hmm.
and then reaches up as high as an F and comes back down a little bit.
Yep.
But I'm also going to say again, here we still have not gotten back to the tonic.
No, we haven't.
It ends on D on the second note of the scale, so one step away from the tonic again.
Mm.
And we have, in songwriting, you often have a call and response or a question and answer. And these first two phrases end as a question because it ends on G. It ends on the dominant chord.
Mm.
So we're just at that point waiting to go back to the tonic.
Hmm.
And we go back to the tonic again the same way as we do at the beginning, not going to the main note of the scale, but we go back to that first phrase again. So I'm just going to go ahead and play from there
Mm.
the second half of the melody beginning here. So this is going to be the third and fourth phrases.
Hmm.
And finally, we get to the tonic. After now 15, 16 measures, we
Mhm.
finally get to our home note
Mhm.
through the whole piece. Again, we can talk about whether something was intentional in the way this was written or if it was something that was subconscious. It certainly is very much a song form the melody repeats itself pretty close to exactly the same way both times. There's a few differences, but it repeats itself almost exactly until you get to the very end. And then at the very end, you come home to the tonic note. Um, and repeating the same phrase twice with a slightly different ending is a very common song structure.
Yeah.
And again, in the entire, the very end of the piece, we have that 3-note motif in each measure.
It's just staggering that the 3 notes are always there.
It's one of those things when, people who are just facile at creating melodies and who are that sort of naturally musical, there's there is sort of an innate ability to put in things that work. And it's partly because music is a language that we all understand, at least so Western music
Mm.
has its rules and it has its chord structures and so forth, and it has, as we listen to music and as we learn music, we start to understand what the syntax of it is in terms of a language or in terms of a way of communicating. And when somebody is really just excellent at writing melodies, they sometimes they just have a subconscious idea of these different elements of putting in something like a step by step 3-note motif, repeating the same rhythms again, the song structure, how you have a question and answer phrase. Those things are all so ubiquitous in our musical language that you don't necessarily have to have a lot of education in music to be able to build melodies that are constructed correctly.
Mhm.
And in this case, it's not constructed just correctly, it's constructed brilliantly. It's beautiful.
It's one of those that more than passes the whistle test in my mind. Like, you will catch somebody humming it just offhand, and that to me is a testament to a job well done. I mean, musically, I know I didn't necessarily do this the whole time, but musically, if Phyrnna were to write lyrics on her own for that, I can imagine every phrase except for the last one, which the last one would end in a full stop. Every phrase before that would either be colon or a semicolon, something to continue the momentum.
I can imagine that. It's a poetic structure because it's basically 4 measures each line, 4 bars for each line of a poem, as it were. And it would have to, I mean, you can end a sentence kind of at the end of the second phrase, but it's not really the end of the whole message there. It's more just left hanging, expecting what the rest of the story is after that middle note there, that D at the end of the second phrase.
Yeah, it's almost like inviting you and saying, "Go on, tell us some more." It does give you that feeling.
In this case, that's pretty much the structure of the melody of the song. The overall structure of the piece has a bridge that the bridge itself is very simple. There are a lot of background notes, but it's a very simple melody overall that just kind of floats over chords that are not in the same key. We've actually completely jumped to a different key. We've gone from C to E flat just sort of as a departure and a bridge, an emotional change from this melody. And I'll play the piano version that has all the notes in the background as well. But you can just hear the melody is just simple 2 or 3 notes per measure, but the harmonies here take us to a completely different place. The chord progressions share some of the movement that's in the main melody, but this is really just kind of it's kind of a dream in between the occurrences of the main melody here.
Mm.
It's similar to, but it is a step out. It also gives you the opportunity, especially in a situation where you're going to be hearing a melody over and over and over and over again. If all it was in C major throughout the entire thing and it didn't shift away and it didn't have a difference in texture, when you're sitting, especially in a game, in a movie, you have a scene that happens and the scene's going to be over when the scene's over.
Mm.
But in a game, you can very often sit in a space and be in that space for as long as you want to. And if
Mhm.
the music doesn't have some extra level of interest, it would get monotonous.
Yes.
And so that's, I think, a useful reason to have a shift in the chords and to take you completely away for a little while, both in the texture and in the harmony.
I mean, what I also find is that it adds another layer of emotion that, if you just listened to what the main melody was, I mean, it feels homely, it feels comforting, it feels like, go on, tell us some more. Uh, but then you get to the second set of chords, your emotions change
Hmm.
completely in a way. It's like, it's a hit of wistfulness, it's a hit of longing that if it was there in the melody,
Hmm.
this kind of amplified it, even though the melody was quite floaty. And you do feel that however long you're sitting there in that world playing this theme over and over again, it hits you in different ways each time. And for various different reasons, we could look forward to the main melody because it's singable. We could look forward to this section because it hits us with a different set of emotions. Emotional literacy is generally how I attack listening critically to a set of chords. What does this do? How does this hit me? And I find that it's very emotionally literate, is this section, even though some people might argue simplistic. It hits the right notes.
Even though you do have that very simplified melody, the background becomes more sparkly and more moving in at least in this arrangement, and there's kind of more going on behind the simple melody, so you can kind of relax melodically,
Mm,
but you're still carried along because there's more going on underneath.
yeah.
And then at the end, after that, we go back to the repeat of the same melody, and I'm gonna go ahead and play out. On the piano version here, it goes up an octave, and then it comes in full octaves at the end. So I'll play the repeat of the main melody of Estavius. And something else I noticed here, the melody in this case doesn't start at a spot and then go up and come back down to the same spot, but it dances around the home note. It starts out reaching up to the home note, but then goes past it, and then it goes a little
Mm,
bit below it. And then again, the next phrase starts a little higher, and it
hmm
again jumps past the tonic note, and it comes down almost to it, but doesn't quite get there.
mm,
You've approached the tonic from below and gone past it, and then come back at it from above and gone
yeah.
past it. And then you've
Mm.
approached it again and gone past it even farther and come back down almost to it. And then we repeat the whole process over again until at the very, very end, we finally circle around the tonic and land on it.
That's brilliant. What do you think about it?
It is unsung excellence, actually. This is an example of how beautiful Fiona's music is and how facile she is with creating singable, enjoyable melodies that don't become too insidious. That
Hmm
this has a long enough length to it that it's not just the same phrase repeated over and over and over again, has enough variation to it where listening to it doesn't become monotonous. It has that break in the middle where you have a chance to breathe from the main melody. It's well crafted with a lot of skill, as well as a lot of, I'm sure, natural talent. This is absolutely excellent work. Let's go ahead and take another break. And when we come back, we will be talking about you. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast. My name is Arthur Breur. I'm your host, and I am here with Troisnyx. It's actually a week later than the previous parts of the podcast because we had a little bit of technical issues. You might have heard in the second section a couple of spots where the sound was glitchy. But we are back now to have Troisnyx do her show and tell part of the podcast. Troisnyx, tell us about what you would like to share today.
The song of mine that I'm sharing today is called The Drummer's Prayer. I wrote this for Game Grooves' Selected Venture album in August, September last year. So Game Grooves released an album initiative for its Creators of Colour, which ended up being Selected Venture. And the prompt that was given us was, if you were a character in a video game, what would your theme be? Now, this piece, The Drummer's Prayer, I initially conceived it in March, attempted to record it, but upstairs neighbours were complaining, banging the ceiling.
No.
I live in a council flat, paper thin walls. It wasn't going to work, so I basically shelved the idea for months. And then when Game Grooves made that announcement, I was like, yeah, it's a no-brainer what I'm going to be doing. It's time for me to rehash The Drummer's Prayer. So that was what I submitted to it, and it became the single longest track on the album, clocking in at almost 5 minutes. So yeah, there we go. That's the song.
How did you get around the challenge of not being able to record in your flat?
Well, I waited for several months for one, so I think by the time I recorded my voice and some of the higher register percussions, the neighbor must have been outdoors because I didn't receive any complaints. But most of the other parts I needed recording, I couldn't physically record them at home because I don't have a drum kit at home for obvious reasons. So I had to go to Sound Skills to get it recorded. Two of the friends in the music group that I volunteer in, they recorded guitar and bass guitar respectively. And I had another friend from Newgrounds, LD Wharton, do mid-side work on the drums as all of this was going on.
So tell us about the message of Drummer's Prayer.
I think how do I even begin? Like, I was terrified of doing songs like this for upwards of 9 years. Well, 9 years really, counting up till now. 8 years at the time of doing this, because I first had the idea put into me in 2013. But, you can't really hide behind very much. Drumming makes me vulnerable. Singing nasals makes me vulnerable, and singing it with that sort of devotional tone all makes me especially vulnerable. So I didn't really know how it would be received. I remembered a lot of past trauma from me wanting to do the drums and me being abused for it by several people, including my family. So it took me a long time to process all of this. So The Drummer's Prayer, when it was done, turned out to be quite a triumphal song. The lyrics certainly hint towards that, there's that chorus section, stand by and watch me, stars above me, trees around me, hearts from far away beating with me. Because there's support, there's encouragement from friends pretty much everywhere that I can find them. And it's been wonderful to see, and I wanted to acknowledge them in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I've only been playing drums for upwards of 5 years now, and really, I'm a late starter in that regard. And I wanted to basically make it a triumphal song for myself and for hopefully any other late starter on any instrument that goes through similar struggles. And I basically also wanted it to be some form of self-offering, so I hope that came through in the piece.
All right, well, let's go ahead and listen to it. This is The Drummer's Prayer by Troisnyx.
Lord.
is gone, the night is here at last. All my thoughts are gone, but I am here at last. Lord, tonight is yours, this heart is yours, this song is yours. Wake, oh heart of stone, for I can feel it near. Wake, oh melody that all the world will hear. Lord, tonight is yours, this heart is yours, this song is yours. Stand by and watch me. Stars above me, trees around me, wind beneath me. Stand by and watch me. Arms around me, hearts from far away, beating with me. The night is dark, but I can feel you near. My eyes can't see your face, but I still know you're here. Take my beating heart, my beating drum, but I
It is absolutely beautiful. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
And my thought as somebody who's been focusing on getting live performances is that would be a fantastic piece for women's choir and percussion ensemble with just a couple of instruments with like a guitar and a bass. And I think I honestly think that, high school ensembles and college ensembles would love performing that. That would be something that would be a blast to perform live.
Wow.
How long did it take you to compose the piece overall?
I think overall, so I only did 1 day in March and then conceived it in 1 day in March, hoping to finish at least the core of it on that day, but then scrapped it because of the complaints. So overall, that 1 day, and then we had about a month to compose and record everything. So about a month and a day total.
Wow, that's beautiful. And it's inspiring. I think part of what comes to mind with me in the lyrics is you talk about the heart's far away. And, you know, I I've expressed before the kind of amazing nature of, I mean, even what we're doing right now.
Mm,
You're in England, I'm in the United States. We're having a conversation across the world about music.
hmm
And we're having this conversation, our hearts are far away, but we're having the same conversation. We're joining together to do this. And
mm,
that was an inspiring element of that to me. Also, it is very devotional. It's very obviously a celebration and a prayer.
mm.
It really is inspiring in that way and feels meditational as well as motivational.
I mean, I will admit, I think a lot of this was also heightened by the fact that we had spent at least a year and a half, if not more, in lockdowns at various different points in time. So the whole Hearts from Far Away thing was certainly heightened at the time of recording this because we all knew what it was like to have to rely on some remote form of communication to just get in touch with each other and check that we were all okay. Um, I suppose what got me so scared. I alluded to this on Twitter yesterday to a friend of mine in my replies. Strangely enough, but we were talking about doing things in music that we were previously scared to do because of abuse, but also because of the scenes that we operate in being particularly rigid. And one of the scenes I operate in is liturgical music. I'm an organist, I'm a music director in two parishes. Um, and change in a lot of these fields, especially where there is rigidity, comes slowly, granted. But I think that's what motivated me to want to do the drummer's prayer in the first place, because I've come across a fair share of organ and chant snobs that have basically told me in no uncertain terms, what devilry/sorcery is this? And that's a terrible thing to say to somebody, especially when it's also culturally inspired. It's not necessarily something that you come across in Europe or North America necessarily, unless you're in certain crowds that are more welcoming of this sort of thing. And some people do, unironically say it with the racist connotations as well. So, in a way, this is me fighting against that as best as I can. Say, well, this is my prayer, and it should have the space to breathe.
What do you want to do next?
What do I want to do next? Some of you have already seen my tweets, so I don't think this is much of a secret now. But I'm slowly laying out the groundwork for a major personal project, a drum and voice album called Tempus Imperfectum. Um, 1 out of 8 of the tracks planned for it, 1 out of 8 tracks planned for it is done. The mixing's done, the recording's done on that one. Uh, I'm in the midst of planning the rest, recording guides, drawing artwork, trying to get people in who might be interested in collaborating with me on that, and so on and so forth. I generally just use the days that I have free for recording the various loose drums around, and or voice, depending on how much time I have. Um, and I'm just hopeful that it all falls into place. I can't give a specific time frame on when it will be done because some of these are basically very similar to the drummer's prayer in that they're choirs and drums. So these can be um, quite labor intensive, to put it mildly. I'm just going to take my take my time on this and just concentrate on delivering the best song that I can give at this moment in time.
Well, I'm going to highly recommend that people go to your SoundCloud and to your other locations online to listen to your music. You have a wide assortment of styles and genres that you have created music in. And it's frankly, it's all beautiful. Everything I've listened to has been inspiring and impressive. And I cannot wait to see what comes next. I'm going to encourage you when you create this album of, you know, with drum and voice, going to encourage you to try yourself or get somebody to transcribe them for choir and percussion ensemble or percussion ensemble and instruments, especially because I really feel like the drummer's prayer is a piece of music that a choir and and put percussionists anywhere, they're going to have a great old time. But I can just imagine that being something where you have a percussion ensemble and a choir on stage and they would just have a blast with it.
I would be I would be happy to get that done. I'm not really sure whom to ask in the way of transcription. I can direct people. I can just about break it down now and say, right, this is what I did. But with regards to the parts that other people put in, that might be a bit harder. I'm like, what do I do? How does it get played? Um, but so I can certainly give no input with whatever it is I've done. The only reason why I've never really released any scores on MuseScore is because it gets too much for me. I tried transcribing an organ voluntary I wrote at one point. Actually, one of Phyrnna's that I transcribed for the organ, but the notes are done. It's all everything else that comes with. It's the voltas or repeat signs, if any. It's the articulation. It's the dynamics. Those just suck the living daylights out of me.
Yeah, I could relate to that as somebody who is creating music for live ensembles. Yeah, all of the little details that somebody has to see to understand how loud to sing or how quiet to sing, or whether they're going to repeat here or repeat there. And my personal challenge, of course, right now is percussion notation. I am not a percussionist, and percussion notation is an alien language to me. I just need to let somebody else deal with it because when I try to do percussion, they kind of look at it and scratch their head.
At the moment, I am preparing for my grade 8 on drums at the moment, so I do need to read from sheets. As such, I do need to be able to transcribe sheets as well if I need to. If I am submitting an original piece to the exam room and playing it in front of the examiner, which I have the option to under Trinity, then I will need to hand transcribe it or transcribe it with MuseScore and then deliver it to the examiner. That's something that I might as well get some practice for. So, I'm happy to do that. I was actually drumming along. I remember the parts off the top of my head as far as the percussion is concerned for the drummer's prayer. It's just everything else. It's
Right.
everything else that just sucks the living daylight out of me.
For folks who don't know, again, MuseScore is the software. It's free music notation software. It also is very powerful in terms of being able to provide audio and recordings and so forth, as far as taking sheet music and letting you hear it. And they're actually, I believe they're working now on making it into a better mixing software as well for version 4.
Oh,
They're on
good.
version 3 right now. But it is free software. It's available. It's fantastic for educators and for students. It makes music notation completely accessible with zero cost. So highly recommend that. And we use MuseScore for the notation that we look at here on this podcast, which, by the way, if you want to see what it was we were talking about while we were talking about Estavius, you can look at the video. Video will be posted on our Patreon. And Troisnyx, tell everybody where they can find you.
Primarily on my website, troisnyx.co.uk, which Troisnyx is spelled Troisnyx. That's Troisnyx. Troisnyx.co.uk is where I'm based. I'm currently overhauling the website, but the domain should be the same. It's just that in future, some of the pages that you see now will no longer exist. So I'm just giving a heads up to everybody because I am trying to streamline everything. Twitter, I am there as Troisnyx. You mentioned SoundCloud, Arthur. SoundCloud and itch.io are where it varies. I am on there under a shortened form of my username, TRSNX. Itch.io, incidentally, is where I post game jam entries along with other people whom I've worked on game jams with. So the things that I've worked on basically show up on my page. If you ever feel like playing some short games, that's where you go. Newgrounds, I am there as Troisnyx, the full spelling of it. And that's one of the other sites where I'm the most active. I still maintain some level of activity to this day. I'm also an audio moderator on Newgrounds, so if anybody among you who is a musician would like to join Newgrounds or run into some trouble with the audio submission process or just audio in general, I'm one of the people that you can hit up, basically.
Excellent. I am Arthur Breur. It's Arthur, and Breur is Breur. I'm that on all of the social medias, and arthurbreur.com. This is the Melodology Podcast, which is melodologypodcast.com. And on all the social media, it is just Melody Podcast. Troisnyx, thank you very, very much for being here today. It's been a joy getting to talk to you twice in 2 weeks because of the technical issues. So bad news and good news.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This has been the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers like Troisnyx. Have a great day, and we look forward to having you back for the next podcast.